Presidential powers. Besides the constitutional authority delegated to the president, the nation's chief executive also has indirect roles. These duties, such as chief legislator, head of party, chief of state, and chief diplomat, truly define the scope of the presidency. Depending upon the skills of the person in office, the power of the presidency will increase or decrease. Each role has a direct relationship with either a political institution or governmental policy-making body. The skills and ability to use these roles result in a shared power relationship. The president, as chief legislator, develops legislative skills and a shared relationship with Congress. In developing a legislative agenda, the president sets priorities and works closely with members of Congress. Three contrasting presidents, Johnson, Carter, and Clinton, developed different styles in this area. Johnson, having the experience as Senate Majority Leader, already had the skills of working with Congress when he assumed the office after Kennedy's assassination. He was able to achieve a great deal of success with his Great Societies program. Carter, coming from the Georgia governorship, was unable to work with congressional leaders and did not implement his agenda. Clinton, although a former governor, used his support staff and developed a working relationship with his own party leaders who held a majority in each house. For the first 3 years of his presidency, he was able to push through significant legislation, including the Family and Medical Leave Act, a National Service Program, AmeriCorps, and the Crime Bill. The fact that Democrats held a majority was a key factor in whether the president's legislative agenda was completed. George Bush, who was a Republican, had to work with the Democratic majority, used a veto 45 times successfully. The veto is a primary tool used by the president to influence Congress to meet his legislative priorities. Historically, there have been over 1,454 regular vetoes, and fewer than 200 have been overridden by Congress. The presidents who have exercised the most vetoes were Franklin Roosevelt at 372, Grover Cleveland at 304, and Harry Truman at 180. Another form of veto a president can use is the pocket veto. This occurs if the president does not sign a bill within 10 days and the Congress adjourns within the 10 days. This tactic has been used over 1,000 times. One of the reasons why the pocket veto is used is that very often there is a rush to pass legislation at the time of planned recesses. One of the issues surrounding the veto is the attempt by some presidents to obtain a line item veto. Many times Congress will attach riders or attachments to bills. These riders, often in the form of appropriations, sometimes have nothing to do with the intent of the bill itself and are often considered to be pork barrel legislation. It becomes a means of forcing the president to accept legislation he would normally veto. In 1994, both houses of Congress passed a line item veto law, which President Clinton signed. Taking effect in 1997, the purpose of the line item veto was to let the president strike individual items from the 13 major appropriations bills submitted by Congress that he considered wasteful spending. The goal of the bill was to prevent Congress from increasing appropriations with pork. The law was brought to the Supreme Court and was declared unconstitutional as an illegal expansion of the president's veto power. As party leader, the president is the only national elected official. Other party leaders, such as the Speaker of the House and the majority and minority leaders of the Senate and the House, are elected by their own parties. In this role, the president has much influence in setting his agenda, especially if he is a member of the majority party. Many times the president will take the argument to the congressional party leaders that their support will make or break the presidency. This kind of pressure was put on the Democratic Party when Bill Clinton lobbied for the passage of his first budget. Another key action the president can take to send a message to Congress is to impound funds. By this act, the president refuses to release appropriated funds to executive agencies. President Nixon used this practice to curb congressional spending. Congress retaliated by passing the 1974 Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act, which set limits on this practice and set up an independent Congressional Budget Office. This act was significant in shifting the checks and balances scale to Congress. Even though he does not directly have the power to appoint congressmen to committees, the president certainly can influence a party member by promising to support pet legislation of the congressman in return for voting in favor of legislation supported by the president. Another area of potential conflict between the president and Congress is that of national security. As chief diplomat, the president has the delegated constitutional authority of commander-in-chief of the armed forces, the person who can make treaties with other nations and appoint ambassadors to nations that are recognized. With treaties and appointments, Congress has built-in check. The Senate must approve treaties by a two-thirds margin and approve presidential appointments by a majority vote. Most judicial appointments are made after checking the appointment with the senator of the state the appointee comes from. This kind of senatorial courtesy often guarantees the acceptance of an appointment, even if there is some minor objection from other senators. Such significant treaties as the 1962 Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty are good examples of the President working closely with the Congress. However, it is the war-making power of the President that causes the most problems. Since the Vietnam War, Congress has become concerned with the President's unilateral commitment of American troops. The Congress responded by passing the War Powers Act in 1973, overriding a Nixon veto. This act states that a president can commit the military only after a declaration of war by the Congress or by specific authorization by Congress if there is a national emergency or if the use of force is in the national interest of the United States. Once troops are sent, the President is required to keep Congress informed about the action and must stop the commitment of troops after 60 days. Congress has the leverage of withholding military funding to force the President to comply. This act has been compared to a legislative veto. The proponents of this measure point to such military actions as the Reagan's invasion of Grenada, Bush's Panama invasion, and Clinton's Somalia and Bosnia policies as examples of why it is necessary for Congress to have authority. Opponents of this measure point to the fact that only the President has the complete knowledge of what foreign policy actions can really have an impact on the national security of the United States. The issue has never been resolved by the courts, and the legislation remains on the books. Other attempts at legislative vetoes of presidential actions have been declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. In INS versus Chadha, 1983, the court ruled that we have not yet found a better way of preserving freedom than by making the exercise of power subject to the carefully crafted restraints spelled out in the Constitution. Congress does have oversight responsibilities over the intelligence agencies through committee hearings. The President's influence over the judiciary comes from his power to appoint Supreme Court justices and grant pardons and reprieves. The difference between a pardon and a reprieve is that a reprieve is a postponement of a sentence, and a pardon forgives the crime and frees the person from legal culpability. One of the most controversial pardons came in 1974 when Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, who had been named as an unindicted co-conspirator in the Watergate scandal. An instance when the court told the President he went too far was the Supreme Court decision in Nixon versus United States, 1974. The court told Richard Nixon he must turn over the Watergate tapes and rejected his argument of executive privilege. An extension of the pardoning power is the power of amnesty. For example, in 1977, Jimmy Carter granted a blanket amnesty to Vietnam War draft dodgers who fled to Canada. President Clinton was criticized after announcing over 100 pardons in the last hours of his presidency. Taken in total, the scope of presidential power raises the issue of whether the office has turned into what historian Arthur M. Schlesinger characterized as the imperial presidency. Looking at the manner in which Johnson and Nixon used presidential power, Schlesinger concluded that power was so expanded and misused by 1972 that it threatened our constitutional system. Even if one assumes that a president must use his power, especially in wartime, the question still remains how much power of the president should go unchecked by the other branches of government. It is a question that is still being debated today. In fact, there are proponents of the imperial presidency who feel that the president must exercise both delegated and inferred powers with the cooperation of the other institutions of government for the best interests of the country.